And so our first speaker is Dr. Yvonne Lawley. She's a professor at the Department of Plant Science here at the University of Manitoba. Her title is Cover Crops on the Prairies, and Dr. Lawley is an assistant professor in the Plant Science Department at University of Manitoba. Her area of research is agronomy and cropping systems. Dr. Lawley's research has focused on several crops, including soybeans, corn, and wheat, and a range of management practices from residue management, strip tillage, to cover crops. Her research involves both small plot and on-farm field-scale agronomy research. Dr. Lawley enjoys communicating the results of her research to a wide range of audiences, including farmers, agronomists, scientists, and especially the classrooms where she teaches at the University of Manitoba.
Thanks for that introduction. In preparing for this presentation today, I was remembering the invitation I had in 2016 to first talk to this group of agronomists at the Manitoba Agronomists Conference about cover crops, and I was thinking just how much has happened since 2016 in this area of cover crops on the prairies. So better defining the context for cover crops on the prairies. It's unique. Many of you as agronomists have probably heard a lot about cover crops and their connection to soil health and climate change goals over the past years. And you might be wondering, is this possible here on the prairies? Well, it might be if we can adapt it to our agronomy, our cropping systems, and our growing conditions here on the prairies. We have a short growing season, and so shoulder season cover crops have a particular challenge fitting into that short shoulder season window we have after cash crop harvest or before planting cash crops in the spring. We also, in our continental climate here, typically have dry falls, although in the last few years that doesn't seem so certain. On the prairies we can deal with excess moisture, drought, even within the same growing season. But dry falls pose another challenge for fall shoulder season cover crops in that we may not have the moisture we need to establish those cover crops at that time we want to be planting them after harvest. And rightly so, we have skeptical farmers who are curious about the practice, but not sure if that's really a fit for them right now. We have few agronomists who are equipped to advise farmers and work with farmers who have goals for cover crops right now. But we do have a small number of early adopters who are really interested in this practice and have been implementing it on their farms. And so in the research that I've been doing at the University of Manitoba about cover crops, I've really taken three different approaches, and I hope to spend a little bit of time talking with you today about the work I'm doing in these three different areas. The majority of my time I'm going to spend with you in the next 30 minutes is going to focus on the survey of early adopters that we did. And I think this has been a really important time to consult and talk with early adopters. And this is balanced with some small plot research as well as on-farm research. And so we'll talk a little bit about what we're learning through each of these different approaches about cover crops on the prairies. So I mentioned it was an important time to be talking, to be listening and to talking, finding out what early adopters are doing with cover crops on the prairies. You know, attending meetings like this one or meetings with farmers. It was clear, you know, in 2018-ish when I started thinking about doing this, that something was happening and it was hard to get information about what was happening or what farmers were thinking and doing with cover crops on the prairies. So being someone who was trained to do small plot research, I really had to grow and change my skill set to be able to consult and do survey work. And thankfully, the right graduate student came along to make this work possible, Callum Morrison, who's with us here today. And through Callum's enthusiasm and dedication to this project, we asked farmers first in Manitoba and then with a wellspring of interest that grew to Saskatchewan and Alberta about the cover crops that they grew in 2020 after doing a pilot survey in 2019. So we asked farmers that were growing cover crops across the prairies about how they were using cover crops, what their benefits and problems were, and why they were motivated to adopt this practice. Again, learning from the 2019 preliminary survey, we also learned that there were a lot of farmers that were interested in cover crops that wanted to participate. So we added some questions that for farmers who were interested but had not grown cover crops in 2020. And those questions focused on what were their barriers to adoption and what will enable further cover crop use on their farms. So diving right in, we heard from over 528 farmers across the 3 Prairie provinces. When I started this project, I think I told Callum, if we heard from 50 farmers, I would be happy. So because of Callum's dedication and relentless pursuit of finding cover croppers across every nook and cranny of the prairies, and for those that took time to participate in the survey, I'm truly thankful to be able to talk about this data set. So we heard from 281 farmers that grew cover crops in 2020, and 47% of those farmers grew cover crops in the shoulder season. So that's, after cash crop harvest, before cash crop planting the next year. And 81% of the farmers that grew cover crops that responded to our survey were growing full season cover crops. So that's a cover crop in place of growing a cash crop that year. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those full season cover crops are used. So from these respondents, they reported over 100,000 acres of cover crops being grown, and 55% of those acres were shoulder season cover crops and 45% were full season. So we also heard from 247 farmers that didn't grow a cover crop, and many of them were interested in growing cover crops. So starting to take a look at this very interesting data set, I'm just breaking down those numbers I just shared with you by province. So we can see that in terms of the percent of farms that responded to the survey, we have a fairly even number of farmers across the 3 Prairie provinces growing full season cover crops. And from from west to east, from Alberta to Manitoba, we have an increasing percentage of farmers growing shoulder season cover crops, which connects with Manitoba having a longer growing season and having more moisture on the prairies. If we take a look at the numbers by the number of acres being grown, we see very similar patterns. We can see that the number of acres of shoulder season cover crops is greater in Manitoba than the number of acres of full season cover crops. So although a large number of farmers are growing full season cover crops, they're happening on a smaller land base, whereas the shoulder season cover crops are being done on a wider land base. Another really interesting thing that we learned from the survey is where these farms are located. So if you'd asked me what this map would look like, I would have, before the survey began, I would have thought this is going to be a strip, hugging the US-Canada border, right? And it was fascinating to see that this practice, this interest in using plants as a tool to improve soil health is inspiring farmers from east to west and north to south across the prairie. So these cover crops have a fit and are being innovated with across the prairies. So when talking to different audiences about cover crops, a lot of people, especially cash grain farmers, say, well, that's great, but that's for the grazers, that's for the cattle people. That's not really for me. And so Callum decided to take a look at the respondents that indicated that they were grazing cover crops versus those that said that they were, or those that didn't indicate that they were grazing cover crops. So taking a look at the data set through this lens, just over half of the cover crops reported in the survey, or the farms that responded to the survey, indicated that they had the intention of grazing those cover crops. So for a fall shoulder season cover crop, that would be grazing them in the fall. For the full season cover crop, that would be where you were, growing that cover crop for the full season and then grazing it at some point. Breaking it down by numbers, just over 40% of the acres were intended to be grazed, but almost 60% of the acres were not intended for grazing. So taking a look at how this splits out by cover crop type, we have a smaller percentage of the shoulder season cover crops that are intended to be grazed, whereas a larger percent of the full season cover crops are not, or were intended to be grazed. But one thing that really surprised me was just how many farms grew full season cover crops for the intention, with no intention of grazing them. And I think that's something I want to understand and learn more about in the future. So taking a look at this information about who's grazing and not grazing cover crops by province, we can see that there's a greater proportion of the cover crops being grazed in Alberta than in Manitoba, and that fits very well with what we already talked about, or what I already talked about with the proportion of full season versus shoulder season cover crops in Manitoba. We asked farmers about how long they've been growing cover crops. And this is very interesting data to understand, and very helpful data to understand in terms of how to engage and provide information to farmers. So we can see here in this graph that the most common response in 2020 was that farmers who responded to the survey had been growing cover crops for about 3 to 5 years, with a large number of them having only grown cover crops once or twice. But we do have a significant number of farmers across the prairies that have been growing cover crops for 10, 20 or more years. We have a lot of different windows for growing cover crops, and this comes out when we ask them what crops were grown before the cover crop in rotation. And so from this list, it's very interesting to see that cereal crops like spring wheat, barley, and oats are among the most frequent. So it makes sense in that these crops tend to be harvested sooner. Maybe they're harvested for silage. And so that is one of the most common windows. But we have a lot of other crops that are preceded in rotation, like canola and peas, winter cereals, potatoes, vegetables, and the list goes on. We also got some good information about what types of cover crops farmers were growing that responded to the survey. So topping out the list includes clovers, oats, fall rye, peas, and radishes. And you can see that there are big differences between the green bars and the red bars in that grazers tend to be growing a lot of different types of cover crops. And I think this comes out really clearly here in this graph that Callum made. This is probably one of the most interesting graphs where we break out the grazers and the not grazers. So the green bars are the cover crops that are not intended to be grazed, and we can see that the most frequent number of species, the diversity of the species is quite low, with 1 or 2 to 3 species. But that peak for the grazed cover crops is really around 4 to 5 or 6 to 7 species. So we're seeing when cover crops are being grazed, that's where we're seeing farmers investing in having more plant types in that cover crop mix and probably spending a little bit more on that cover crop seed mix. So that was a really interesting graph. This is probably the second most surprising graph from the whole survey to me. And that was when we asked, how did the cover crops get planted, or when did they get planted? Did they start the cover crop as an intercrop? And although we had a lot of respondents say no, we planted it instead of a cash crop, so that means a full season cover crop, or the middle column here, no after cash crop harvest, we had around 35% of respondents, I guess averaging between the grazed and the not grazed. So a very high number of respondents say that yes, they did establish the cover crop as by interseeding it with a cash crop, either at planting or broadcasting it later in the growing season. And this, to me, is a theme I'd like to pick up later on in my presentation. So we asked a lot of questions about the agronomy of how these early adopters were growing cover crops. We also asked them why. Why are you doing this? And among the most common responses for both grazing and not grazing respondents was focused on soils and soil health, increasing soil carbon, keeping living roots growing in the soil. There was also goals for weed suppression, reducing soil erosion, improving water infiltration, scavenging nutrients, and the list goes on. We asked them about benefits. What have you seen when you grow cover crops? And these benefits that they reported were very similar to why they were growing cover crops: improved soil health, less erosion, increased soil organic matter, less weeds. So although none of these benefits were, me going out as a scientist to measure, these benefits are the benefits that farmers are seeing and that are motivating them to do this practice on their farm. Probably this is the most surprising graph for me from the whole survey, is how long did it take for the farmers to see those benefits that they self-reported as being observed. And 70% of the respondents said that they observed these benefits within 3 years. And, you know, as a scientist working in this area, I'm hoping to see some of these benefits, you know, in my long-term studies. And so farmers are seeing benefits, and I can't say what are those benefits, but they're seeing those benefits in the short run. So that's important to follow up on and to find out more about. But we also know that these cover crops aren't magic, and there are challenges that we need to address as scientists, as agronomists, in collaboration with farmers to advance this practice if it's going to advance on the prairies. So not surprisingly, shortness of the growing season tops the list, as well as lack of moisture in the fall. Not surprisingly, additional costs for, you know, purchasing seed and planting that seed in the ground. The impact that having cover crops, especially if they're intercropped, on herbicide choice is also important to address. And the list goes on here down to, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So we're just going to move on. Enabling cover crop use. So we also asked these farmers, what could we do to enable cover crop use on the prairies? And amongst the top of the list here are responses related to compensation, paying for carbon, storing carbon, tax credits, as well as research needs, so research specific to the prairies for cover crops. Further down the list, we find, you know, the desire for local networks, local farm tours. So we have all those different elements in farmers signaling to us what they need to move this practice forward on the prairies. So to summarize this work on, you know, finding out from early adopters what they're doing with cover crops on the prairies, we found out a lot of important information that we didn't have just a few years ago. We found that the majority of prairie farmers that had started using cover crops in 2020 had seen benefits, that 70% of those farmers experienced those benefits within 3 years, but that a lot of those farmers had also experienced challenges. Callum really likes this point, that although there are challenges, no farmer that responded to the survey selected that their old system or the old way that they were doing things without cover crops worked better. And so I think that's a strong motivating signal to continue with this work of adapting this practice for the prairies. Things that might enable cover crop use include financial incentives, additional information, and establishing local networks for farmers. How am I doing for time, Marla?
6 or 7 minutes.
I got 6 or 7 minutes. Hey, I'm doing well. I was wondering if that was going to take my whole time lot. So, connecting this survey work that we did, finding out what farmers are doing, some of the other research going on my lab is happening on farm. We're learning about cover crops with farmers. So my graduate student, Dale Penner, has been working with on 6 fields across Manitoba from east to west, looking at replicated paired fields where we just test the farmer's rotation on its own and then the farmer's rotation with cover crop. And our goal for this on-farm experiment is to build some of that cumulative history of cover crops in those replicated strips over time. So Dale's been measuring many different impacts of cover crops across these fields, and because I have less than 6 minutes now, I'm going to talk only about, you know, how much biomass or how much growth were they able to have in these grain-only systems over time. So we can see here in this graph that the cover crop growth in 2019, when it was really wet in the fall and it was really cool, we didn't have much cover crop growth. In 2020, in the fall, when it was too dry, we also didn't have much cover crop growth. And surprisingly, it was in 2021 when the growing season was way too dry, and I thought that none of our farmers were going to want to grow cover crops. Well, it started to rain at the end of the fall, and they were ready. after 3 years. They planted cover crops, and that's where we had our best growth. Most of them were growing fall rye that fall. Now you'll notice that there are paired graphs, paired bars on each of these graphs, and that's because we measured the regrowth of volunteers and the weeds that were growing in our control strips. And you'll notice there's not a lot of difference between my yellow bars, the volunteers, and the green bars that were the cover crops we planted. And so I think this is really important and informative about how we can think about strategies for cover crops on the prairies. Maybe volunteers, what we blow at the end of the combine is going to be an important part of making cover crops work on the prairies. Now, we also looked at ground coverage, and we did see advantages in terms of having better and more complete ground coverage where we actually planted the cover crops compared to relying on volunteers alone. So we measured, for 7 of the fields, we were able to measure cash crop yields in our cover crop and no cover crop strips. And given, the small amount of biomass growth we had in 2 of the 3 years here, maybe it's not surprising that there weren't many differences between our treatments. So I think the big take-home message from this graph is that, cover crops, if we have moderate amount of growth, are not going to be train wrecks. But we have a lot to do to figure out how to grow cover crops for the prairies. And that's going to take some good old-fashioned agronomy work. And in the interest of leaving time for questions, I'm not going to go through any of Virginia's data, but Virginia Jansen is a graduate student in my lab who's really been looking at this cover crop performance triangle. How do we optimize cover crop performance through species selection, management, and then all the factors that are unique to our prairie environment? So she has been looking at fall rye termination, and we've been looking at how to optimize fall rye because it's a good and reliable cover crop, and I'd be happy to talk with you sometime if you have growers that are interested in using fall rye and want more information about how to terminate, when to terminate fall rye cover crops. And she's also been looking at different species to optimize that fall species window. So we did a planting date study from mid-August to mid-September, looking at 8 different species. So skipping right along, I said that one of the most surprising things I learned from the cover crop survey was how much intercropping was happening. So this is where, Yvonne Lawley meets Lana Shaw. And my research interests are merging with hers from a cover crop angle. And so I have a new project started with Linda Gorham at the University of Alberta and Marissa Bourgault at the University of Saskatchewan to take a look at how we can intercrop cover crops or get them established when intercropping them with wheat and canola. Slightly different crop type and slightly different angle or end use. I'm also looking at intercropping cover crop species with corn, but because we're intending to graze them, we're just calling them annual forages. So if anyone is interested in learning more about intercropping corn and cover crops, maybe for grazing, there's going to be more data coming from that project in the near future. So my last slide is, if you're an agronomist in Manitoba looking for information about cover crops, it's a bit of a challenge. There's a lot of information about cover crops, but a lot of it isn't relevant to the prairies. But that body of work is building, and here are a few places and some key resources that you can access. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to those that participated in the cover crop survey, for all the agronomists out there who helped us spread the word about this survey, for the farmers that are helping us achieve this on-farm research project, and to the graduate students, technicians, collaborators, and funders that join me in this journey. So with that, I don't know if there's any time for questions. We'll go from there.
Do we have a quick question from the audience?
Thank you. I'm Vikram, and a pathologist. I have seen some of the radish that has been grown as a cover crop. What is your experience, and how many farmers have grown radish again and turnip? We are a canola country here, so do you think about the repercussions of not a break from crucifers?
Sure, no, I think that's a really important part of species selection, right? So if you are in a rotation with canola, having diversity in the plant types that you grow for cover crops is important. Even if you don't have canola in your field or in your rotation, you probably have neighbors with canola. And from my experience, flea beetles have been the biggest challenge for establishing radish cover crops. So radishes definitely come up in the list of species that are being grown by early adopters, but there are some real rotational challenges that need to be thought of, and we probably need some work in that area to find what are the best plant species to complement the diversity of a prairie rotation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We have a small speaker.